Wind drifted low across bare fields, pulling the last cold of the season through gaps and rotted fence posts. Gideon Frost worked without speaking, hammer, nail, wood, mending what months of frost had split apart. A former Navy SEAL with no one coming home to him and no reason to expect otherwise. He had drawn lines around his life the way other men draw curtains. Tight. Final. Then a woman appeared at the edge of his property, belly swollen with child, a cracked suitcase in one hand, and nothing behind her worth returning to. No tears, no story offered up for sympathy. "I can work," she said. "Just let me stay." There are battles louder than gunfire, and there are doors heavier than any man should have to open alone. What happened next, between two people who had every reason to stay broken, started on a cold, damp afternoon. He nearly turned away. Something deeper than thought wouldn't let him. Before we begin, drop the name of the city you're watching from. We'd love to know where you are. If this story reaches something real in you, hit subscribe and walk this road with us. Now, let's go. Late March, early evening. Snow had only just retreated from the fields of Flathead Valley, leaving the earth soft and uneven, the air still carrying winter between its teeth. The farm stood exposed against open country, wind passing through it without resistance, dragging the smell of wet soil and weathered timber. Fence lines broke across the pasture like sentences no one finished. The barn sat quiet, its doors hanging slightly crooked after months with no hands to tend them. Gideon kept at the fence. The hammer rose, fell, struck clean. No wasted movement in his arms, no wasted glances, though his eyes swept the field every few seconds. Instinct, not choice. His hair had grown past any kind of shape. Stubble caught the fading light along his jaw. There was something in the way he held himself, a readiness that didn't belong to farm work. The kind that stays etched into a man's nervous system long after he leaves the SEAL teams. Axel stood beside him, motionless. 7 years old, built like the trained canine he was, muscle packed tight under dense fur, ears high, eyes sweeping the tree line. Axel almost never barked. He didn't need to. Most people read his posture and stepped back before sound became necessary. His body alone drew a perimeter few were willing to test. The hammer froze mid-swing. Axel had locked in place, not because of a noise, because of an absence. Something had shifted in the pattern of the place. Gideon traced the dog's gaze outward, his own muscles already drawing taut before his mind caught up. Someone stood at the far end of the dirt road. A woman. She hadn't stepped closer, just held her ground by the gate, as though calculating the distance between where she stood and where survival might begin. Lyra Dane. She looked younger than everything she carried. 29, though the road had pressed quieter years into her face. Dark hair, loosely gathered, with strands torn free by the wind and pressed damp against her temples. Dust lined the hem of her dress, the fabric pulled taut over a round belly that shifted gently with each breath. One hand gripped a suitcase, leather split at the corners. The other rested low on her stomach, fingers pressing in slightly, steadying herself, steadying what grew inside her. She moved forward, not quickly, not with hesitation either. Axel released a low growl from somewhere deep in his chest and shifted half a step ahead of Gideon. Every line of the dog's body said the same thing: uncertain, locked on, ready. Gideon raised one hand, barely. Axel stopped. His eyes didn't. The gap between them narrowed enough for detail to settle. Her shoes had worn through at the soles. A fine layer of red dust coated her calves. The way she shifted weight from one foot to the other, small, nearly invisible, spoke louder than anything she could have said. She had been walking a long time, maybe longer than a long time. She held Gideon's gaze without flinching. "If you let me stay," she said, "I'll work on your farm." Her voice came out level and clear, shaped by exhaustion more than fear. No tremor in it, no plea. Just an offer set down between them like something solid, something with edges. "I can cook, clean, help with whatever you need." Wind slipped between them, lifting strands of her hair, nudging the loose planks of the fence. Gideon didn't speak. His eyes stayed on her, but his attention had drifted. Somewhere deeper, somewhere older. A part of him recognized this moment instantly. The stillness before a choice that doesn't allow reversal. He'd felt it before. Different terrain, different stakes, same weight pressing against the chest. And beneath that recognition, something else. A hesitation that had nothing to do with threat. It rose from somewhere deep. Not a thought exactly, more like a shape. The outline of a life that had once held firm, then didn't. It moved through him without needing language. Axel looked back, brief and steady, waiting for direction that never came. Gideon let the breath go slow, his gaze dropping just long enough to find the curve of her belly. A child. That shifted everything. He stepped forward, boots sinking into wet earth. "I'd rather eat what comes out of this ground than anything sealed in tin," he said, voice low, almost careless. "You know how to keep something alive in soil like this?" Lyra gave a single nod. "Yes." Her eyes held his without flinching. Gideon reached for the gate, the hinges caught, then surrendered with a long, dry groan that carried across the open air. Louder than it should have been, like something locked in place finally being forced to remember motion. Axel stepped aside just enough for her to pass. His body stayed turned toward her, alert, measuring. Lyra walked through. For one still moment, all three of them stood inside the same boundary. Close enough now that distance couldn't serve as shield. Then the wind died down and the farm, months deep in silence and repetition, shifted its rhythm. New weight pressed into the ground. The front door shut behind Lyra with a flat, hollow thud, as though the house had forgotten the sound. The air inside hung motionless. Faint dust, old timber. Something started and never completed. A jacket dangled from the back of a chair, one sleeve dragging the floor. Tools lay spread across the kitchen table alongside a chipped mug and a folded paper no one had bothered to move. In the corner, a box sat sealed, its contents either forgotten or deliberately left alone. A thin film of dust lined the window ledge, holding the day's last light. Not neglected, just unoccupied. Lyra lowered her suitcase against the wall. Her gaze traveled the room slowly, resting on one detail, then the next. She said nothing, asked nothing. She walked to the kitchen and reached for the mug first. Gideon stayed by the doorway, arms loose, watching without a word. Axel stood slightly ahead of him, body still angled toward her, still undecided. Water hit the basin and filled the quiet. Plates clinked. A drawer slid open, then shut. Lyra worked through the space with patience, moving around it rather than against it. By the time the sun slipped below the horizon, something in the house had changed. Not repaired, just steadier. That evening she cooked. The supplies were thin. Beef, a handful of potatoes, onions, garlic. But the smell that climbed from the stove moved fast, through the kitchen, down the hallway, into the walls themselves. As if the house had been waiting for it. Axel came in first. He sat near the stove, ears pitched forward, tail resting against the floor. Not tense, not easy either, watchful. Gideon leaned into the doorframe, arms folded now, eyes tracing the small things. How she checked heat by feel, how she moved through the kitchen like she'd already memorized it. Neither spoke. When the food was done, she placed the plates without ceremony. They sat across from each other at the same table. The silence remained, but its pressure had changed. Gideon ate slower than usual. Axel waited for permission, then took his piece gently, testing more than flavor. Lyra finished first. Her hand found her belly now and then, small, unconscious. When she rose to clear the plates, Gideon spoke for the first time since they'd sat. Lyra glanced up. One nod. He kept eating. It wasn't much, but something between them shifted. Gideon woke before dawn the next morning. Same as always. Sky still black. That particular hush before the first birds stir. He stepped from his room expecting the house to carry its usual emptiness at that hour. It didn't. A dim glow reached from the kitchen. The low murmur of something on the stove, a spoon turning slow against ceramic. He paused in the hallway, then walked in. Coffee on the table, fresh. A plate of bread, still warm. Lyra stood at the stove with her back to the room, her movements deliberate, unhurried. Axel had already settled near the doorway, his eyes tracking her with something softer than yesterday's vigilance. Gideon rinsed his hands at the sink, muscle memory, nothing more. When he turned around, the mug was set out and waiting. He sat, drank, said nothing. But he didn't get up to leave either. The shifts were subtle. Lyra didn't reorganize the house. She didn't ask permission or question where anything belonged. She moved within what already existed, adjusting only the smallest things. A towel folded rather than draped. A tool returned to the spot where a hand would reach for it next. A window cracked open, just enough for the air to remember how to circulate. Axel stayed closer to her now, not pressing against her, but no longer holding back. Some moments he sat nearby while she worked. Other times he padded ahead of her, clearing the room before she entered it. Gideon saw that too. He kept it to himself. That afternoon, finishing the last room at the far end of the hall, Lyra found the frame. It rested face down on a small table. She paused. Part of her considered leaving it exactly that way. Then she turned it over. A photograph. Gideon standing beside a woman, both of them dressed for a wedding. The woman leaned slightly into him, her smile wide and unprotected, the kind of smile that assumes tomorrow will come. Lyra studied it for a few seconds. Then she placed it back precisely as it had been. Wind gathered after the sun dropped. It swept low across the fields, leaning against the walls, threading through gaps in the old boards. Gideon sat on the porch with a mug, staring into the black. Lyra came out a few minutes later, pausing near the doorframe before settling at a short distance. She let a moment pass. 10, she said. But the woman in the picture? Gideon didn't respond right away. My wife, he said, his voice level, stripped clean. She lived here. Then she didn't. His gaze drifted toward the fence line. Left with someone else, real estate guy, college friend. The kind who always had the right words, always had the time. No bitterness in it, just a flat surface, smoothed by years of weather. Lyra listened without interrupting. After a while, Gideon turned his head slightly in her direction. What about you? She looked at her hands, fingers resting loosely together. Why'd you leave? Lyra drew a breath. Her eyes stayed down. Sometimes you leave a place, she said, just so you can begin again. The wind passed between them once more, gentler now. Neither spoke after that. They sat side by side, facing the same darkness, each carrying a different weight from it. The farm had started to shift in ways no one needed to name. Green shoots pressed through the soil behind the house, small but steady. Clothes hung in neat rows along the fence, swaying with the breeze instead of lying crumpled in some forgotten corner. The kitchen held warmth now. Not just heat from the burner, but the warmth of something used regularly, quietly, with care. Axel had decided. He stayed near Lyra when she worked, by the doorway beside the counter, watching without strain, not standing guard, just there. Gideon noticed all of it. He talked less, if such a thing were even measurable, but he stopped lingering outside as long. Some evenings he came in early, sat at the table for no particular reason, and listened to the low hum of the house settling around him. He hadn't planned any of it, it just arrived. The sound of an engine cut the quiet one afternoon. Gideon was out the door before it reached the gate. Axel moved ahead, body tight, gaze locked on the road. The car stopped, a beat of nothing. Then the door swung open. Maris Hale stepped out. Her steps came fast, uneven, like something had been building in her chest too long. By the time she reached the gate, her voice had already cracked. Quote, _18, ___. He didn't move. I shouldn't have left. I thought I knew what I wanted. I didn't. She shook her head, fighting to hold herself together. I still love you. I never stopped loving you. He's not who I thought he was. He's nothing. I made a terrible mistake. Gideon stood with his hands loose at his sides. His jaw tightened, barely, but enough. The front door opened behind him. Lyra stepped onto the porch. Maris saw her. Everything froze. Her eyes traveled from Lyra to Gideon, then dropped and stayed low. Who is she? No one answered. Maris moved a step closer, her voice turning sharp. Why is she in our house? She exhaled, sharp, clipped, barely a breath at all. Don't tell me. That's yours? You moved on that fast? Lyra answered before Gideon had the chance. I'm just staying here, she said. Helping around the place, nothing more. Maris let out a laugh with no warmth in it. Then leave. This isn't your place, never was. Lyra said nothing. She stood there one moment longer, then turned toward the house. The door shut behind her. From inside, the sound of drawers opening, footsteps, the quiet drag of a suitcase across floorboards. Gideon stepped forward. Maris grabbed his arm. "You're really letting her stay?" she said. "After everything." He pulled free. "This isn't about her." "Then what is it about?" Gideon held her gaze steady. "This place stopped being ours the day you walked away." Maris went still. He hadn't raised his voice. Didn't have to. "You don't know what the last 2 years have been," he said. "And you don't need to." The words carried no force, but they didn't leave. Maris opened her mouth, closed it again. Whatever she'd driven here to say no longer held its shape. She stepped back, slow, the fight draining from her shoulders. For a second, it looked like she might try once more. She didn't. She turned, walked to the car, and pulled away without a glance in the mirror. By the time Gideon crossed the yard, Lyra was already at the gate, the suitcase caught on the rough ground behind her, dragging unevenly. Axel stood in her path. He had the suitcase strap clamped in his jaw, holding it still. Lyra looked down. __quote _33 __. He didn't release it. Gideon reached them a beat later. "Stay," he said. Lyra shook her head. "I shouldn't. At least until the baby comes safe," he said. "You've got somewhere to be out there?" He looked toward the empty road. "You don't." Her grip tightened on the handle. "I'll figure it out." Gideon paused, searched for better words, gave up on finding them. "I'm no good at asking people to stay," he said. "But I don't want you out there alone right now." That was everything he had. Lyra looked at him, then down at Axel, the dog still holding the strap, patient, unmoving. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not much. Enough. A quiet breath out. "All right." Axel released the strap instantly. They walked back together, not side by side, not apart, just back inside. Everything sat where it had been, but the house didn't feel the same. Lyra set the suitcase against the wall again. This time she didn't reach to unpack it. Gideon lingered near the door another moment, then stepped outside without saying anything. Axel stayed in. He lay between the two rooms, chin on his paws, watching both directions. Silence settled through the house again, but not the silence from before. Something lived in it now, something neither of them had a name for yet. Days moved forward, steady, unhurried, until they began to orbit a single point, when the baby would come. The rhythm of the farm slowed on its own, no one deciding it should. Morning still started with coffee. Evening still ended with light stretching long across the fields. But the work changed. Less urgency, more attention to what was near. Gideon started on the room at the end of the hall, made no announcement, just walked in one morning, cracked the window open, and began. The glass had gone dull with time. He wiped it until it caught light again. The hinges groaned when he tested them, so he swapped them out without a second thought. The bed frame needed reinforcing. He tightened every joint, checked it twice, then once more. Lyra noticed without asking. She passed the doorway several times a day, slowing just enough to register what had changed. The room felt different with each task he finished. Not new, ready. He worked in pieces, never rushing, as though he understood exactly what he was building toward, even if he never said so. The shed took longer. It hadn't been properly opened in some time, the door caught halfway before giving. Inside, everything sat where it had last been set down. Tools, old planks, a few shapes draped in cloth. Gideon moved through it slowly, shifting things aside, clearing space. Then he found it, the cradle. Pushed deep toward the back wall, half buried beneath a worn sheet. He pulled it free and stood still for a moment, one hand resting on the rim. He didn't move right away. The wood had kept its form, sturdy, deliberate craftsmanship, though the lines weren't quite true, built by hands that didn't do this daily. He wiped the dust off with his palm. Years since he'd last touched it. Back when it carried different weight. Back when plans still clung to it. He lifted the piece, carried it into daylight, set it down, and began. A rag, water, a screwdriver. Every corner wiped clean, every joint inspected, each loose fitting drawn tight until the whole thing held again. No hesitation, no commentary, just the quiet sound of something being mended. Lyra stood in the doorway, watching. She didn't cross the threshold, didn't say a word, but her face shifted, the way a face does when it reads a story no one has spoken aloud. After a while, she turned and left him to it. The night it came, the house was still. Wind had gone quiet. The fields lay flat and breathless. Axel caught it first. One sharp, short bark, enough to split the silence clean. Gideon was already moving before the sound finished landing. He reached the hallway just as Lyra's door swung open. She gripped the frame for a moment, breathing uneven but held. "It's time." One nod. "All right, no panic." Nothing wasted. The truck turned over within minutes. Tires bit into the dirt road, scattering gravel behind them. Axel jumped into the bed without a command, gaze locked forward. Nobody spoke during the drive. The road opened ahead of them, empty at that hour. Sky still dark, just barely shifting at its edges. 4:15 in the morning. Hospital light replaced the dark, clean, bright, merciless. Gideon stayed outside the room at first, paced once, then stopped. Axel lay against the wall, ears up, waiting. Time moved differently inside those walls. Minutes stretched longer. Every sound carried sharper. Then it came. A cry, clear and strong. Everything else dropped away for a second. A nurse stepped out, voice even. "It's a boy." Gideon let the air go slowly, like he'd been holding it longer than he knew. Inside, Lyra held the child close, wrapped in white, still warm from arriving. He moved closer, slower this time. The nurse asked. Lyra looked down at the baby, then across the room. Elias. The name settled into the space like it had always been there. The days after didn't follow any pattern. Sleep arrived in fragments, hours blurred together. But the house changed. Gideon learned fast. Not flawlessly. He held the baby with the same measured care he brought to everything. Steady hands, small adjustments, eyes tracking every tiny shift. Axel stayed near the cradle most hours, never crowding, just close enough to catch any movement, lifting his head each time the baby stirred. Lyra rested more. For the first time since she'd come, her sleep ran deeper. No sudden jolts awake, no tightness in her shoulders when her eyes closed. The room at the end of the hall carried a different silence now, not hollow, full. One evening, Gideon stood in the doorway watching. Lyra sat beside the cradle, one hand resting against its edge. Axel lay nearby, eyes half shut but alert. Elias shifted, let out a small sound. Both looked up at the same moment. Nothing planned. It simply happened. Gideon lingered a second longer, then stepped inside. No words. He reached down, adjusted the blanket slightly, made sure it sat right. Lyra didn't stop him. Outside, the last light drained from the fields. Inside, the house held something new, something steady, something that required no explanation. The night it happened, the house had finally eased into a fragile kind of stillness. Elias slept in short, uneven breaths. Lyra rested close by, one hand always within reach of the cradle, even in sleep. Gideon sat in the chair beside the door, not reading, not doing anything particular, just present. Axel caught it first. A car engine, rough, uneven, slowing too late before the gate. His head came up, ears pitched forward, a low rumble built in his chest. Gideon was already standing. Headlights swept across the yard, too bright, too careless. The engine didn't cut right away, then voices, loud, unsteady, carrying the kind of boldness that doesn't come from thinking anything through. Lyra was awake now. She pushed herself up slowly, one hand reaching for the cradle before moving toward the doorway. Gideon stepped outside before anyone could reach the door. 3 men stood near the gate. One moved ahead of the others, working to hold his balance without letting it show. "Lyra," he called out. Took him long enough to track her down. She was coming with them. That's what the voice said, slurred at the edges, alcohol pulling the words apart. Gideon said nothing. The man kept closing the distance. "You hear me? This ain't your place. You don't belong here." Lyra appeared in the doorway behind Gideon. "I'm not going," she said. "Clean. Final." The man laughed, shook his head. "You don't get to decide that." One more step forward. That was all it took. Axel moved, fast, direct, precise. Jaws snapping shut inches from the man's throat. The crack of teeth meeting air cut through everything. Then stillness. The man locked in place, breathing wrong. The 2 behind him backed off immediately. Gideon stepped forward, slow, measured. "You've had your say," he said. No raised voice, no threat, but every syllable carried weight. The man swallowed hard, eyes pinned on Axel. "You don't know what you're getting into," he managed. Gideon didn't answer. That silence said plenty. A second passed. The man took one step back, then another. The others were already at the car. The engine turned over, louder now. Gravel sprayed as they tore out. The yard went quiet. Axel held position until the last trace of sound dissolved into distance. Then he returned to Gideon's side, calm, as though nothing had happened at all. Inside, Lyra hadn't moved. She stood rooted in the same spot. Then something gave way. Not loud, not sudden. She lowered herself into the chair, pressed both hands over her face. The tears came without sound. Not fear, but the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that leaves nothing else standing. Gideon held still for a moment, then moved closer. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to fix it, just stood near enough. After a while, her hands came down, breathing still ragged. "He won't stop," she said. Gideon shook his head once. "He will." She looked up at him. "How do you know?" He held her gaze. "Because from now on, nobody touches you unless you say they can." The words landed between them. No hesitation, no hidden meaning. Lyra nodded, slow. For the first time since tires had hit the gravel, her shoulders released. The paperwork outlasted everything else. Weeks bled into months, calls, forms, waiting rooms. Lyra handled most of it on her own, quietly, without asking. Gideon drove her into town when she needed it, sat outside offices in the truck. By early autumn, it was done. The court signed the final order. The past, on paper at least, was closed. Lyra didn't celebrate. She folded the document once and set it down. Freedom didn't arrive as a moment. It arrived as space. Maris returned one last time. No edge in her voice now, no argument coiled behind her eyes. She stood by the gate holding something close. Gideon walked out to meet her. "I'm not here to stay," she said. He nodded. She extended a small bundle, a soft blanket neatly folded. "For the baby." He took it. Neither spoke for a stretch. Then a brief nod from her and she turned and she left. Gideon stayed a beat longer, blanket still resting in his hands. "Thank you, Maris," he said, barely above a breath. Then he went inside, set the blanket beside the cradle. Maris left it. Lyra looked at him, then at the blanket. She tucked it around Elias, a quiet smile settling into place. The wedding came together without ceremony or plan. Word moved through Flathead Valley the way it always did. People who'd once lingered by the fence, watching, whispering about the woman under his roof, now came through the gate with full hands. Those who'd kept their distance carried chairs, arranged tables, stayed. Harold Boone showed up early, tools already out, mending the gate he'd once said wouldn't survive another season. Etek Cole claimed the kitchen without discussion. Ryland Voss raised a canopy in the yard, steady, exact. Nobody mentioned what came before. Lyra stood beside Gideon when the time arrived. No long vows, no speeches, just a few words, spoken clean. Axel stayed close, a strip of cloth tied loose around his neck, still watchful. When it ended, nobody left. They stayed. Plates moved hand to hand, voices eased into something warm and unhurried. Spring returned. The ground gave again. New growth held the fields. Inside, things shifted once more. Lyra stood in the doorway one morning, something in her hands. Gideon looked up. She didn't say it right away. Then she did. "I'm pregnant." He went still for a second, then stepped closer. "All right," he said. Just that. But the weight inside those two words had shifted, carried something it never held before. When the baby arrived, it was a girl, Claire. Gideon stood in the yard that evening, watching light pour slow across the fields. There was a time he believed distance was the only thing keeping everything from collapsing, that locking people out meant holding himself together. He saw it differently now. Some people leave. That truth doesn't soften with age. But sometimes someone stays, and that's enough to build from. There are moments in a life that don't announce themselves. No thunder, no grand sign. They arrive quietly. A stranger at a gate, a hand that doesn't pull back, a home that opens when it had every reason to stay shut. Some would call it coincidence. Others might reach for a different word. Maybe it's grace. Gideon had always believed strength meant standing alone. But what actually changed his life wasn't force. It was the willingness to let someone remain. And inside that single choice, something unseen stirred. A broken place began to soften. A guarded heart remembered how to trust. A family took shape where once there had been only silence. If you're listening, maybe there's a door in your own life that's stayed closed a long time. Maybe there's someone nearby who just needs a little room, a little kindness. You don't have to do anything grand. Sometimes not turning away is enough. If this story stayed with you, pass it along to someone who might need it. Or leave a quiet word below. I read them more often than you'd guess. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, subscribe and stay a while.